Meeting to order. First order of business is into closed meeting. Be it resolved that the Montgomery County Board of Supervisors of Montgomery County, Virginia hereby enters into a closed meeting for the purpose of discussing the following. Section 2.2-3711, discussion, consideration, or interviews of prospective candidates for employment, assignment, appointment, promotion, performance, demotion, salaries, disciplining or resignation of specific officers, appointees, or employees of any public body. 1, Adjustments and Appeals Board. 2, Library Board. Do I have a motion?
Motion.
Second.
Motion and second. Any discussion? Madam Clerk, if you'll call the roll.
Mr. Fischer-Kowski?
Aye.
Mr. King?
Aye.
Ms. Biggs?
Aye.
Mr. Motts?
Aye.
Mr. Shepherd?
Aye.
Chair Blevins?
Aye.
6 ayes.
We're in closed meeting. Madam Clerk, if you'll please call the roll.
Aye.
Aye. Mr. Motts?
Aye.
Ms. Bone?
Aye.
Mr. Shepherd?
Aye.
Mr. Christiansburg?
Aye.
Chair Blevins?
Aye.
7 ayes.
Certification of closed meeting. Whereas the Board of Supervisors of Montgomery County has convened a closed meeting on this date pursuant to the affirmative recorded vote and in accordance with the provisions of the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, and whereas Section 2.2-3711 of the Code of Virginia requires a certification by the board that such closed meeting was conducted in conformity with Virginia law. Now therefore, be it resolved that the Board of Supervisors of Montgomery County, Virginia, hereby certifies that to the best of each member's knowledge, 1, only public business matters lawfully exempt from open meeting requirements by Virginia law were discussed in the closed meeting to which this certification resolution applies, and 2, only such public business matters as were identified in the motion convening the closed meeting were heard, discussed, and considered by the board. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Motion and second. Any discussion? Madam Clerk, if you'll please call the roll.
Ms. Biggs?
Aye.
Mr. Motts?
Aye.
Ms. Bone?
Aye.
Mr. Shepherd?
Aye.
Mr. Christiansburg?
Aye.
Mr. King?
Aye.
Chair Blevins?
Aye.
7 ayes.
And at this time, I'd like to ask our County Administrator, Craig Meadows, if you will lead us in a moment of silence and the pledge.
Yes, let us stand, please. Let us pledge, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much.
Next up is public address. We have a sign-up sheet. I don't think we have anybody signed up, but if there are any citizens that would like to come forward to the lectern, you have 4 minutes. If you'll please address say your name and your address.
Good evening. My name is Johnny Ashley. I live at 2675 Glade Drive, Christiansburg, Virginia. I am here to request legislative changes to reinforce parental rights in family court. The state legislature has already passed most of these laws, but if no one enforces them, then they aren't real laws. There is also a multiple interpretations of the best interest of the child law. DSS returns children to drug addicts because it is required to get federal funding. Family court says the best interest of a child is that a natural parent has no rights to their child, even without showing of evidence that would be required for DSS involvement. Even without any evidence, a parent isn't fit. The court can charge child support. Per Social Security Act, Title IV, the federal government matches what the state collects in child support for general funding. Abduction is to gain control of someone by violence, threat of violence, or deception. But if the deception is to a judge, perjury, law enforcement's policy is not to investigate. Theft by deception is basically fraud, to gain money or property by false pretense. And the First Amendment of Virginia's Constitution says that a law is valid unless legislative action is taken. So to rephrase the Montgomery County Sheriff's policy from last week, they violate the Constitution to protect child abductors, which protects the state's theft by deception racket, which I'm sure helps them get funding. Now replace the word state with mafia. How does that sound? That's why I can't have a multi-county grand jury, because if people found out what the state's policy was, they would be outraged. It has to be kept a secret. Even the other government agencies can't know about these policies. I started having bad panic attacks. I haven't really talked about the false reports made against me yet. I've been investigated 3 times for molesting my son. I've never been charged, and nothing happened to the family who stole my son for falsely reporting me. For some reason, I'm not supposed to be bothered because I was never charged, but in my eyes, they have an infinite number of chances to have me falsely convicted on a heinous crime and given a long prison sentence. So I go to the hospital for anxiety. They contact Access, a mental health agency which is part of the New River Valley Community Services, a county agency. Even though the sheriff deputies were there and could have told them I was right about their policy, they didn't. Then one county agency didn't believe another county agency's policy. I was now delusional and couldn't care for myself. I would like to thank the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department for assaulting me and handcuffing me to a bed for my own safety for repeating their policy. I get out to the hospital. I get my paperwork. I prove my story's true, and my diagnosis changes from schizophrenia to PTSD. I get out. I file a complaint. I've already proven to the hospital everything I said was true, but Access refuses to contact them and TDOs me again. Was this retaliation for filing a complaint, or Access refusing to do their due diligence to find out the sheriff's policy? I was sent bills for this. I want my money back. Please stop turning child abduction into a profitable business. Thank you.
Thank you. And is there anyone else that would like to do a public address? You can come forward, sir. Hello, you have 4 minutes if you'll state your name and address.
Good evening. My name is Wayne Coleman, and my address is 1741 Stratford View Drive in Blacksburg. And I would just like to pray for you guys for this coming year. So, Lord, I want to thank you for each one of these officials, the board members and the administrators, the lawyer, and the secretary, and all the others who pour out of themselves to serve. And I pray in the name of Jesus that you would touch each one, that you would minister peace and courage, especially in the face of adversity, that you would guide them by your Holy Spirit, that they would know the presence of your Spirit. They would become, if they're not already, they would become intimately familiar with the sound of your voice. Lord, this year is a pivotal year in the kingdom, and we don't know what's going to happen in the natural. But I pray for each of these that you would guide them, show them the way, show them your face, and let them hear your voice. I ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. Not seeing anyone else, we will close public address. Next is addendum.
We have no addendum this evening, Madam Chair.
All right, no addendum. Moving on, do I have a motion to move into work session for the purpose of discussing the FY 22-23 budget?
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion? Madam Clerk, if you'll please call the roll.
Ms. DeMonts?
Aye.
Ms. Bone?
Aye.
Mr. Shepherd?
Aye.
Mr. Wojciechowski?
Aye.
Mr. King?
Aye.
Ms. Biggs?
Aye.
Chair Blevins?
Aye.
7 ayes.
Thank you, everyone. We have a couple of items on our work session this evening, and we entitled it Fiscal Year Budget 2022-2023. I believe Mr. Magruder is going to walk us through these. The first thing that we're going to cover this evening are the preliminary revenue projections for the upcoming fiscal year. Then we'll talk a little bit about this has come up from several board members about the funding process that we use as we evaluate outside agencies. And then the final item under the work session this evening will be a discussion of our upcoming budget calendar. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, good evening. We'll talk a little bit about our preliminary revenue projections for fiscal year '23. County revenue falls into two categories, undesignated revenue and designated revenue. Undesignated revenues are unrestricted, meaning that they can be used for just about any governmental purpose. Designated revenues, on the other hand, are restricted revenues, meaning that they are earmarked for a specific purpose and can only be used for that purpose. So each year I kind of go over the revenue categories just to give you some background. The undesignated revenue piece is really the bulk of the county's revenue, and it's going to be the focus of tonight's presentation. And that makes up about 89% of all county revenue. Real estate taxes, personal property taxes, and sales and use taxes, as a general rule, those three categories make up and drive the bulk of the revenue growth that you see on a yearly basis. The designated revenue piece represents about 11% of the county's revenue, and it's made up of comp board revenue that supports the constitutional officers and local user fees. So if we go back to 2008, and 2008 was a pivotal year because that was the last time we had a really major recession. And at that time, the undesignated portion of the county's revenue represented about 80%, and the designated portion was about 20%. So if we fast forward to now, you can see, as I just showed you on the other slide, that we're at 89%. So what that tells us is that local revenues in the budget have outpaced the state designated revenues. In a certain sense, they've kind of remained fairly flat. So if we go to 2009, the undesignated portion was at 81%. By 2013, it was 87%, and now we're at 89%. So you can see we're on a slippery slope where we're providing more local dollars to pay for things. So as a result, the local governments have been responsible for generating the additional revenue required to adequately fund public education, public safety, and our constitutional offices. So I wanted to talk a little bit before I get into where we're going into next year, talk about where we are in the current year, which is in fiscal year 22. And I can just tell you the last 2 years have been pretty atypical, not normal at all, as far as what we're seeing revenue-wise. The county is experiencing growth in the current year in our revenues that is significantly above historical trends. And so while the county expects to retain some of this growth going into next fiscal year, most of the revenue growth that you're going to see on the next slide, I think, is going to be one-time in nature. And almost all of this revenue growth is due to the pandemic. Some of the issues that we're facing, which you guys have seen and heard on the news, there have been supply chain issues. There's been an undersupply of new motor vehicles, which has boosted the prices of used vehicles. Sales tax collections that in the current year are 21% above normal trend, and that is mostly due to pent-up demand. People didn't take vacations, they had extra money, there was government stimulus, there's been inflation, and of course people are using their savings. Prior to the pandemic, the national savings rate was significantly low. During the pandemic, people saved up a lot of money, and now we're back at a place where the national savings rate is back to pre-pandemic levels. So people are spending the money that they had saved up. And then we have delinquent tax collections that we're getting that is a result from a collection agency that is putting out efforts to get that. And then on top of that, the consumer's ability to pay. And then recordation taxes due to increased real estate sales and valuations. So these things are sort of not typical. And so I don't expect, as we look forward into 2023, a lot of this revenue going to be there as a continuous piece. So additional revenue, and I have never said this, and this is my 18th year here, but we are estimating, and again, this is an estimate, so it's projected, and it's based on our current trend. It has not happened yet, and things could change. But if we keep going in the direction that we're going, I'm estimating that we will exceed our undesignated revenue estimates by $7.4 million. And I've given you a breakdown here of where that revenue is coming from. As you can see, we're getting around $200,000 from real estate. Personal property motor vehicles is roughly $800,000, and that's mostly due to that undersupply of new vehicles and the used vehicles being boosted. Delinquent tax collections at $2.3 million. Again, that's trended out, so I mean that may not happen by the time we get to the end of the year, but if we keep collecting at the rate that we're collecting, that's where we would end. Sales tax collections at 2.8 million above the estimate, and then recordation taxes at $1.3 million above the estimate. So the total that I expect us to exceed our revenue estimates is $7.4 million. And this is not just typical to Montgomery County. If you look at the state's revenues, they're way off the map. Albemarle County, I saw an article in the newspaper that that their numbers were through the roof as well. So it's not typical, or I should say that we're not alone in this. So what do I think we're going to retain, or what do I think will be in the base that we can then add to next year's numbers? In real estate, $200,000 I think will be maintained. I think we'll maintain the $800,000 in motor vehicle valuation. I think we'll maintain around $300,000 in delinquent tax collections, $600,000 in sales tax collections, and then about $100,000 in recordation taxes. So we're looking at roughly $2 million in the base before we add new growth on top of that. So last year I presented this chart to try and help explain our revenue growth and give you guys a better understanding of not only what we see in the base, but then the new growth that's added. So when I talk about base revenue or the base revenue change, that's the ongoing difference in the current year undesignated revenue collection versus what the budget estimate is. And on the previous slide, what I'm showing as the base changes, I think we're going to retain $2 million of that 7.4 going forward. The new revenue growth is additional revenue from new construction, the acquisition of new personal or new business property, and then increases in the consumptions of goods and services such as sales taxes. So you take our base revenue change plus the new revenue growth, and then you get the total new revenue for the next fiscal year. So before I go into next year's new growth numbers, I want to kind of go back 2 years. So 2 years ago, I stood here and we talked about where we were revenue-wise, and at that time, I was telling you guys that we were in the longest period of economic expansion in U.S. history. Then the budget team went away, we did our magic, and we came back with a budget. We presented that budget at the first Monday in March. The day after we presented the budget, the Fed slashed interest rates to zero, and we immediately went into a recession. The reason I'm telling you that is that things can change, and sometimes they change very dramatically. And so I don't really know what's going to happen in the future. I can only look at what the past has indicated for us and give us a trend about where we're going to be. So I'm going to talk about potential impacts that I think we may face down the road. So right now, there are various opinions on the economic outlook for calendar year 22 and 23. And the reason I say calendar year 22 and 23 is because most economic projections are not based on our fiscal year or the federal fiscal year. They're based on calendar years, and people are looking at where we are now relative to where we'll be at the end of this calendar year. And so most economic forecasts are positive, particularly for 2022. But there are some storm clouds on the horizon, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those things. When I'm looking at what most revenue forecasts are suggesting, they're suggesting that 22 is going to be good, but there could be issues in calendar year 23. I think that when we go through these things, if everything goes according to plan, we may not see the impact until our fiscal year 24. I think it may be late in 23 when, if we get into a major recession, that's when it's likely to occur. Again, I don't know that that's what's going to happen, but based on what I know and what the forecasters are saying, the potential would more likely be in 24 is when we would have a major recession, if we have one. But some of the things that are issues right now, inflation is an issue and currency devaluation. I mean, you can go to Walmart, you can go to McDonald's, you can see prices are up from where they were previously. We have supply chain issues, and then there are issues with that correction. The Federal Reserve has some monetary policy issues that need to be addressed. The stock market is currently overvalued. If you look at U.S. equities, they are priced at the end of December, they were 200% above GDP, which means that they are expensive. The bond market is overvalued because of low interest rates. We have real estate levels at all-time highs. And of course, the pandemic isn't over yet, and we are still dealing with COVID-19. So as you know, as we go into this economic forecast, I am positive about where I think we're headed. I don't think that the world's going to come to an end anytime soon, but there's always the potential. In other words, nobody would have thought when I did that revenue presentation and I was telling you how great everything was that the next day the Fed would cut interest rates and we would be right into a recession. So just be mindful that, you know, things can change and they can change quickly. All right, so let's talk about our new revenue growth. Historically, new undesignated revenue growth is around $2.2 million per year. This year's projection is $3.2 million, and the reason there's an additional $1 million relative to the normal $2.2 million is because of extra real estate construction that's going on right now. We have several apartment complexes that are going on that are going to come on to the calendar year 23 real estate book. And then there's a lot of commercial stuff in Christiansburg that's going to come online as well. So the projection that I'm going to show you is based on actual real estate book values, the calendar year 2021 book, land book, plus what we know is already on the book for calendar year 2022, and then known construction that is planned for calendar year 23. We're also using the actual personal property book values based on the calendar year 21 book and then historical growth patterns. And then there's been some anomalies in some of these revenue numbers, which I've kind of already pointed out. And so I went back and did normal trend analysis for sales tax based on historical growth patterns and not using the current 21% year over year number in order to do that. In other words, when you're trying to project your revenue, 9 times out of 10, it always goes back to normal trend line. And so it would make sense to go back to normal trend line to project forward. You don't want to use an anomaly and then try and put growth on top of that and then end up with too much revenue and too much in your revenue projection and you don't make that number. And then this projection does not reflect any potential economic downturn or a motor vehicle supply correction in calendar 22. So again, I'm looking at normal trend and trying to project what I think is going to happen based on a positive economic outlook going forward, at least through 22. So our new revenue growth for 23, again, that's $3.2 million. That's made up of real estate. Normally, that real estate number is about $1 million. This year, it's $2.1 million. Personal property, motor vehicle, and other personal property categories at $700,000, and sales tax at $400,000. Gives you $3.2 million in new growth. So this next slide just kind of gives you a lot of detail, but as you can see, I have a roughly $2 million in base revenue growth, and then an additional $3.2 million in new revenue growth, and that gives us a total revenue increase of $5.2 million. I want to talk a little bit about the December 2021 proposed state budget. According to the schools, the additional state funding in the 2023 budget is estimated at roughly $2.3 million. For the county at this time, there's additional compensation board revenue that's expected based on a 5% salary increase from the state for constitutional officers and their staff. And that amount of funding is roughly $610,000. However, there is non-supplanting legislative language that requires the county to provide at least a 5% raise to those employees in order to receive the revenue. Angie, do you have anything that you'd like to add or say?
I just wanted to thank Mark for the work that he's done. As he said, this is not a typical year, and we have a great deal of confidence in his ability to project the revenue. We're very thankful for that. He probably knows more about the economy than anyone else I know. And while we don't know what's going to happen, we feel comfortable that this is the best path forward as far as how much to add for new growth in the coming year. As Mark said, it's important that we don't put too much revenue into the estimates for ongoing expenses, because then the following year we will have to make up a hole. And it's really important that we are doing the best job that we can right now to get the estimates as close as we can and to provide the continued financial stability that the county does have, especially as we get ready to issue bonds this spring or summer.
Thank you, Angie. I was going to chime in with that very comment that, as we get ready for a significant bond issue in the coming months for the Christiansburg High School project and also some projects for the county, we want to make sure we are fiscally responsible and conservative. We've had quite a bit, Mark and Angie and I have had quite a bit of discussion about the numbers. We challenge, Mark challenges the base, and then we challenge Mark. But I feel very comfortable with the recommendations he's presenting this evening, but I'm sure he'll be glad to answer any questions should the board have any.
All right. We just go around the room and see if any of the supervisors have any questions. Supervisor Fidzikowski?
Mark, back on page 5, where you have the additional fiscal year 22 revenue, sales tax collection. This is the sales tax the state sends us, right?
That's correct. That's the 1% that we get of the sales tax. And that number is through the roof.
Yeah. Is it all from people stocking up on toilet paper?
I don't exactly know what they're buying. I just know that they're buying a lot, and the numbers that are coming in are just they're high every month. One thing that I do know, just anecdotally, is that there has been a trend down. There are certain companies that are seeing a downward trend in purchasing in recent months, and a lot of this was pent up demand. People didn't spend money. They had their savings rate went up a lot, and they decided to spend. The other thing is there was a lot of government stimulus that was put in play. So I've tried to figure out exactly what all this means and what it looks like going forward, and it's kind of hard to tell. The other thing about sales tax that you hadn't asked this question, but that concerns me is one of the things that the new governor has talked about is taking a portion of that sales tax away. I've estimated that if that were to happen, we potentially could lose $1 million in revenue based on gross receipts data that I was able to look at. The other issue, sometimes when the state, they have said, well, we're going to give you some of that money back. When they do that, a lot of times what happens is we don't really get the full benefit of that. Sometimes they'll give us a flat dollar amount in current dollars, and it stays forever. And then we don't see that growth every single year. An example of that would be PPTRA. We have a flat dollar amount, and if you remember years ago, that provided a 70% relief on personal property motor vehicles, and now it's down to 35%. And because it was a flat dollar amount. So I don't know what's going to happen with that sales tax issue, whether or not that will go in or what the state will provide, but that's going to be an issue with that particular revenue, not just with what's going to happen with it locally.
Is there a way to break that down? I mean, because you're talking about basically tax on food.
That's correct. So we tried to. I mean, I don't have the full data set to be able to determine that, so I tried to look at some major categories to see if I could kind of get close. And right now, I think that number is around $1 million that we would lose if the state were to eliminate that. But then again, if they give us some money back on that, then I don't know how much money that's going to be either. So.
Okay, on that same page, you have delinquent tax collections. You're not talking about real estate.
I'm talking about everything.
Okay,
So it's
so
real
we-
estate, it's anything that's delinquent.
Okay.
But that particular category is sort of a fixed dollar amount. In other words, there's a limited supply of delinquencies out there. So once you collect them all, then there's no more to get. Now, there's a certain portion that gets added every year, but, it's kind of like, it's easy to kind of attack and take a lot out of the top, and then the stuff at the bottom is a little harder to get to, so.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Supervisor King?
I don't have no questions right now. I want to go through this so I can get all my questions at one time, but I do appreciate you and your staff for all your hard work on this. I mean, I've been here 8 years now, and you hit it right on it, and I do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Supervisor Demott?
I do have a few questions, but I'll start with thanking you. It's always interesting to have the behind the curtains view, and I think you've given us a very well-reasoned projection. It's all very understandable, so I really appreciate that. I'd like to talk about slides 5 and 7 with regards to just a little bit of analysis of your methods for the recordation taxes, and then on slide 7, the statement, real estate valuation at peak levels. And the reason that I'm asking is what I am seeing in the local real estate market is very much a supply and demand issue. There are way more buyers than there are houses. So I'm interested in that trend and how you came to that. Do you think the real estate market will slow down locally or what have you? And then with the real estate valuations at peak levels, I think those two kind of go hand in hand a little bit. We have a very unique economic engine, and so to follow a national real estate trend here, I know that there is some, but it's not quite as severe. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts with regards to the real estate trend for Montgomery County.
Yeah, you're definitely right. I mean, real estate sort of is a local thing. As far as the recordation tax, I go back and I looked at where we were in 20, and then prior to 20, all the way back to 2002, to get an idea of roughly what our trend is for those two categories. And there's actually two categories there. It's recordation and additional tax on deeds. And when you trend that out, I have the number right in front of me, but essentially the number, I've placed that number directly in line with the growth pattern under normal circumstances. So let's say that the real estate market corrects, or some of this pent-up supply-demand issues resolve itself, or there's nothing to purchase, then you're going to see that downward trend back to normal trend. In other words, as I said earlier, everything kind of goes back to normal trend at some point. The question is when. And I don't necessarily know when it's going to happen. I just know that if we project off of these extreme, there's only been like 2 or 3 years of really high numbers in those areas. And so I'm not going to try and use those numbers as where we're going to go forward. Now, there is potential that next year those numbers could still go up. On the flip side, what I do know is that the Fed plans to have at least 3 interest rate hikes, at least 3 in the current year. So that's going to push up interest rates. I don't know what those hikes are. Really, that's the biggest wild card in this. It's how the Fed responds to their monetary policy issues in the next 12 months. If they increase interest rates, then what you're going to see is the cost of borrowing is going to go up, and so that could cool off the real estate market. I don't really know how quickly that's going to occur. Sometimes there's a lag time. So we may see some additional growth in recordation, but I'm always going to go back to trend because that's the safest bet, because we know that, I've got at least 20 years worth of data that shows we should be here. We've got 2 peaks over here. I'm not going to try and go off the peak. I'm going to go back to normal trend. The question is when is it going to stop? And I don't know the answer to that, but I don't want to put us into a bad situation where I'm using peak values to project forward and then we don't realize it. The worst case scenario would be that, the best case scenario is you have a little extra revenue at the end of the year. Now, not 7.4, that's like almost unheard of, and that's never happened. But if you have the extra revenue, you could at least do something with it. If I were to overproject and then we don't make the revenue numbers, then you're gonna have to cut stuff. And that is way more painful than deciding where to put some extra money.
And I really appreciate you saying that because it gives us a lot of information about your approach, which I think is a very wise approach. And I think if anybody is watching that's also interested in the real estate market, it gives a little bit of a conservative financial outlook to how we are approaching things as a county. Just saying, you know, we're not relying on this to continue forever, and it's, I think, in our best interest to not project that this is just going to be year in, year out. So I appreciate you giving us a little bit of insight into your brain. And then just for clarity, the 7.4 million, I know it's undesignated. So those types of things would be advisable for use on one-time projects, like maybe a park in Reiner or something like that.
Absolutely.
That would be great. Okay. And then the final question that I have is about the grocery tax information that you referenced. So I know Senator McNamara has submitted a bill to cut the tax entirely. I think the tax is at 2.5%. Is the locality portion of that tax $1 million for us annually?
So I kind of backed into that number. In other words, we still get 1% of the value. And so what I tried to do was look at some gross receipt data for some big retailers so that I could have some sort of idea of, where that might be, where that might come from. I don't have detailed data. I don't have access to it. So I can only look at kind of broad categories. And I think, based on those broad categories, that I'm estimating that we have the potential to lose about $1 million if that were to come true. So.
Okay. I appreciate that. I don't like that number. But thank you very much for spending so much time on this and for going over it with such detail for us. I really appreciate it.
Supervisor Bone?
I have a couple of questions, and mine start on 5. Just to piggyback on Supervisor DeMott's. So when I look at trends and I see some peaks, that's a great opportunity for one-time purchases or savings. And so the question might be, sure, let's build out a park in the county that might be in Reiner, or do we need to have more reserves, or what's the reserve situation?
Yeah, I think that's something to think about. Particularly, I didn't go into a lot of detail, but one of the concerns that I have is that, in 2010, we sort of had this same situation with our motor vehicle valuation, where at that time there was an oversupply of used vehicles on the market, which could again happen because right now we have an undersupply of new. So once the supply chain issues correct themselves, then all those used values that were boosted up are going to kind of come back down. And I don't know when that's going to happen, but I do know that I've seen that story before, and I was caught off guard by it the last time, meaning I didn't see it coming. This time I can see it coming. The question is when is it going to happen? I don't think it's going to happen in 22. I think there's too much blockage right now for that to correct itself within the next 12 months. But it's highly possible that that particular category could correct itself by the next year. So if you look 24 months out, if that were the case and we don't have enough new growth to offset that, then we could have the same situation where we have an oversupply of used vehicles and then the prices plummet. And then we would have to react to that. So that is a concern going forward, particularly, that's why it's good to, it's not a bad thing to have some extra money in place in case something bad were to happen, because you can at least respond in a positive way.
So I can pretty much follow what you're saying, but I'm going to ask what I call stupid questions because I don't understand it 100% here. So when you were talking about sales tax collections going up or slowing down because, you know, we're at a peak, there was a time in the last several years where the state wasn't passing on sales taxes, the online sales taxes, like they should have been, but that it got corrected. Is that 100% corrected?
I can't tell you for certain because, you know, that's through the Department of Taxation. And so the only way that I would know that would be, we'd have to audit their stuff, and we have no way of doing that. So I can't tell you for certain, but, you know, we are receiving online sales stuff. Question about whether or not we're getting what we're supposed to get, I couldn't answer.
And so people are purchasing online more and more, especially through this pandemic. So we would expect that that would continue for the next 24, 48 months also, right? Okay. You said something about the recordation taxes, and then you also added additional taxes on deeds. What's additional taxes on deeds?
I'm not exactly sure, you know, there's, they have two separate categories that they charge for when you purchase a home, and both of those get recorded. So that happens in the clerk's office. I don't know you know, what that additional tax is or why it's there, but there's probably some statutory requirement that not only you pay the recordation tax, but in some other additional tax that is mandated by the state.
And that's retained here in the county?
Yeah, we get a portion of that, that's
Okay.
correct.
So the current year column is what we're experiencing. Is that what that column is?
That's what I think is going to happen by the time we get to the end of the year. It's
Okay.
based on the revenue collections that we have now it's based on the first 6 months of this year compared to the first 6 months of last year and how we ended last year based on that first 6 month period.
And then the base change is if we weren't experiencing this peak.
Mark, can you pull slide 5, page 5 back? Yeah, I believe, and that's the slide you're referring to, Sarah? Okay.
So year over year, because the previous fiscal year was about the same as this fiscal year, we should expect $7.4 million. Am I understanding that?
I'd say that again. Sorry.
We're in a peak.
Yes,
We're not normal right now.
that's right.
So based on your experience in the last fiscal year, you expect that this current year, we should see 7.4 million.
Right, in the current year, yes.
Yes.
Yes. And then what I'm saying as far as the base growth, what do I think we're going to retain? In other words,
Moving forward.
moving
without
forward
the peak.
without the peak. In other words, I think, you know, we're going to retain the real estate value. We will retain the motor vehicle value as long as there isn't a correction, which will happen at some point. I just don't know when, but we'll retain that until that correction occurs. And then if you look at our delinquent taxes, if you look at trend, I think that the trend says I can add $300,000 more to our existing base number, and it is in line with our base trend numbers.
Gotcha.
And then the sales tax numbers, I went back to 2000, I went back to 2020 and looked at where we were prior to the pandemic, then took 2020, which was mostly, fiscal year 20 was mostly not pandemic related because it wasn't until
Right.
March that things really went off the rails, and we were 3/4 of the way through the fiscal year, and said, okay, what is our normal trend, and then try and project from that point forward up until we get here. So in other words, if the growth rate was 3 or 4% per year, then I took that number from 20 and said, okay, what should we be at right now if we grew at normal trend?
And those are your base numbers.
And that's where I'm going more, yes.
Okay. Would you consider these numbers on this page conservative?
I would say they are responsible.
I hear you. And then on page 8, I have before you go there, page 5, the delinquent tax collections. So a couple years ago, we were doing a lot of real estate delinquent tax stuff. Is that done yet? Or is most of it done? That special law firm that was doing that for us? is it
They're
done?
still, I'm not sure if it's a law firm. I know there's a collection agency that they have turned it over to. I think it's called Tax, that goes and collects that stuff. So, they're doing a really good job right now. I mean, their numbers are way up, much higher than where they were last year at this time. So again, that could trail off by the time we get to the end of the year. I mean, again, if they did a lot of work on the front end and they got this stuff that was easy to get, then it's going to be harder to get some of the other stuff. It may go down. So, I'm going to be doing these projections all the way through the fiscal year. So I'll have at the end of this month, in a few days, I'm going to rerun these whole number set and then see where we are. And then I'll do that again at the end of February and in March. So I'll have a better idea of where we're trending in the current year as far as where these numbers are. These numbers could go higher or they could go lower. We'll just have to see.
So on page 8, the third bullet of the third bullet, the normal trend analysis for sales tax base on historical growth patterns. What is the historical growth pattern rate?
If you go back prior to the pandemic.
There a number?
Yeah,
Is what
yeah.
I'm saying, yeah.
Yeah, if you go prior to the pandemic, it was less than 3%.
Wow.
And in fact, if you went way back during our last recession, we went like 4 fiscal years before we peaked, and then it took us 4 fiscal years in order to get back to the peak amount after it declined.
Next page. The way that actually, I'm not going to look at that page. I'm going to look at page 10 at that $5.2 million off of $121 million. So that's like 4%, right?
I'm not sure.
Well, 5 million, 5 million over 121 million is about 4%. Is that? So,
Yes,
so
that's
the
right.
expense
Close,
of,
yeah.
so inflation is actually more than that these days.
That's correct.
So we're actually behind. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at December, the inflation rate was 7%. What I can tell you about that is that that's an aggregated total. And so I don't really necessarily believe that inflation is 7% on all goods and services. It's an aggregated total. You can look at certain prices and they're up 40, 50, 100% over where they were, depending upon the particular product and, whether there's a supply chain issue with that or if it's a raw material or what it is. So in certain categories, it's not going to be 7%. It's going to be way higher than that. But if you look at what they use for CPI numbers, the year-over-year trend for December compared to the last December was slightly over 7%.
I wonder what Montgomery County's inflation is for our purchases. Do you have any idea?
Not off the
Our
top of my head.
Purchases? Okay. I think that's it. Thank you.
Supervisor Shepherd.
I'm always amazed at how well you do your job, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I don't have any questions or any more questions at this time. Thank you.
Vice Chair Biggs.
I want to thank you again for, bringing this. You always do a great job. I mean, and you're usually right on target. As you all know, I've been very concerned about what we're going to lose due to the reduction in sales tax if the grocery tax goes through. It's not that I'm against, getting rid of the grocery tax, but I remember what happened with the car tax. So I'm very glad that you gave us an estimate of the million, because I think it's important when we talk to our folks in Richmond that they need to understand if we lose $1 million, that's $1 million we're losing to provide services to our citizens. And I know it sounds great, but unless they can come up with a sustainable replacement for that, I'm really worried about it. And I've heard different theories about, well, we can take it out of the surplus that the state has. Well, the surplus isn't always necessarily going to be there. So that's one thing I think that maybe when we go talk to our folks in Richmond, we need to make them aware that this can have a real impact on our budget in the future. So I'm really glad that you were able to give us that information. I did have a question, and I think it's just me not understanding. On page 11, can you explain again about the constitutional officers, the compensation board, and the 5% salary, and how that relates? Because we also have plenty of employees in those offices that aren't paid for by the compensation board. So how is all this going to fit together?
Yes, so in the past, when we would receive additional revenue from the state, because the constitutional officers were on our pay plan, it was all just considered revenue. In other words, for the most part, when you were on our pay plan, you got paid more than you would have if you had stayed on the state's pay plan. And so we would always pay either what the state said was the minimum or whatever our pay plan was, and our pay plan was always much higher than that. So when we would get additional revenue from the state, we could book that as a revenue to support what we were already providing. I think it was in 2018, they put in legislative language that said that even if we were providing more expense over and above or paying higher for a position than what the comp board paid, if they gave a raise, we had to match the raise even on the fact that it didn't matter that we were paying more. We couldn't just book it as revenue. We had to give the employees a raise. And so there's a non-supplanting language piece that says that we have to at least provide that. If they give 5%, we have to make sure we give that to the employee. And you're right, it does create issues because in order to get that revenue, we would have to provide the 5%. But if we didn't do that for everybody, then there would be people in certain offices that would potentially get the raise and people that wouldn't, or we would forego the money that we would receive from the state.
This is the same thing that happens on the school side when they get money for teachers' salaries. So, but it's a really good point for helping folks understand, some of the things that we face when we're making these decisions. So thank you very much. That's all.
Mark, again, I'll just echo, excellent job. Thank you and your staff for always being detailed and giving us the perspective of what you're forecasting, but also to be very conservative and responsible with that. So we do appreciate that. Just going back, if you look at slide number 5, and this kind of goes along with some of the other supervisors on the delinquent tax collection. And I know that is that's pretty high because you talked about it's easy to get that bulk and then that's one-time fees. Can you tell me, is this because, how far did these delinquent taxes go? Is this something that is 5 years back? Is this from COVID, or do you have any idea?
No, I think that it's a combination of things. There's a certain point at which, it becomes non-collectible, but there's a certain pot that sort of is out there that we try and capture. And so, I'm tracking that every year to see where our beginning balance is, what we've added to the delinquency pot, and then what we take away, and then what our percent is relative to that amount. So I could tell you, we collected this amount of what was available to get at that time. And so the estimates that I'm providing as a base going forward is based on our normal collection percentage relative to what the pot is. And that's taking into consideration that we're going to get what I think is $2.3 million above the number in the current year. And so that's how I get that number. But a lot of that, it's not, I don't think that it's COVID related because, you guys deferred the tax payment, and then that was immediately collected. And our collection rates are in line with where they've always been. So part of it is stuff that's hard to collect, and then you keep adding to the pot as we go. And that's why I can add money to the delinquency total, because the pot gets bigger, and then as we collect as a percent based on trend, that number gets bigger as well.
Very good. And again, I think it's very, you explained this well to us and also the citizens, that even though it looks really good, tomorrow things can change very quickly, and that this extra money would be one time, not something that would be base growth at this point. It would be one time, kind of catch up, but nobody's spending and doing things during the COVID, and now just catch up on everything, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Are there any other follow-up questions? Well, thank you, Mark. Appreciate you.
All right, board members, the next item under our work session this evening is a discussion of and I'm going to take my mask off. I know some folks are having trouble hearing this evening, so I'll try to be clear. Is a funding process for outside agencies. Over the last year or so, we've had several questions about how outside agency funding works here in the county, and we've had a procedure in place for a number of years, but asked Mark this evening if he would review that with the board, and at the end, we'll see if you have any input or suggestions on what we could be doing differently. So Mark, back to you.
All right. I think Supervisor DeMotts had brought this up maybe in November or December and asked, was this a good time? And this is an excellent time to take a look at this. So I wanted to give you a little background. The county currently funds 46 outside agencies, and those are made up of agencies that are serving and funded by multiple New River Valley localities, and then 2 agencies that serve just Montgomery County. For fiscal year 22, the county is providing roughly $2.8 million to all outside agencies, and that represents roughly 3.2 cents of the real estate tax rate. And then those outside agencies are broken down further into 5 separate categories: human service agencies, public safety agencies, educational and cultural agencies, environmental agencies, and economic development agencies. So of those 46 agencies, there are 13 that are mandated agencies, meaning that there is some sort of requirement in place for us to fund the agency. For fiscal year 22, those 13 mandated agencies are funded at roughly $1.7 million, and that represents 1.9 cents of the real estate tax rate. And they are basically, the reasons for the mandate are either state code requirements and agency membership, or there's some sort of contractual agreement between the board and the agency. There are 33 non-mandated agencies, and the funding for fiscal year 22 is roughly $1.1 million, and that represents 1.3 cents of the real estate tax rate. As far as new dollars that were requested in this budget process from outside agencies, and this is where we are to date, there are a few agencies that have yet to submit, but existing agency requests for additional funds is roughly $511,000. New agency requests that have never been funded before have requested $54,000. And so the total request for all agencies is nearly $565,000. So I want to talk about the budget process that we go through. So each year in November, the county sends out budget request information to those agencies that historically have been funded by the county and to other agencies who have contacted us that want to ask for new funding. In late January, early February, the county organizes a joint budget review meeting for agencies serving and funded by multiple New River Valley localities. And there are a lot of benefits to this particular joint budget review meeting. The benefits to the agencies submit one budget request that includes all jurisdictions. So they have kind of a unified form and process that they go through, and that the agencies get to present their request to all localities at the same time. So it's sort of a time-saving thing where they get everybody in one room and everybody has an opportunity to discuss the request. The benefits to the localities, it provides staff from the jurisdictions the opportunity to evaluate the request as a group and to provide equitable funding recommendations back to their governing bodies. And we always receive positive feedback from this process. In fact, in 2011, I went back and looked at this, and only Mary Biggs, Supervisor Biggs, was the only board member at the time, but we received a NACO award, achievement award for this process, and on a national level. So it is a really good process, and the agencies really like the format. Analysis of the funded agencies. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we do each year when we get these agencies and we look at their funding requests. So the funded agencies are evaluated based on specified criteria. So some of the agencies have a fixed or a flat dollar amount that has been assigned. Some are there's a specified formula or it's population based. And then others are prorated based on clients served per jurisdiction. In other words, we're looking at whether or not we're paying our fair share relative to the peer group of other localities that in which these particular agencies serve. As a general rule, we don't cut agency funding if the county is actually paying more than its fair share, but under those circumstances, we wouldn't add any additional funding if they requested new funding and we were paying more than our fair share. If the county did cut agency funding based on that, as a general rule, the amount is very minimal and wouldn't really yield a lot of significant savings in doing so. There's really no criteria in place right now to evaluate reducing or eliminating funding for agencies, or if there were agencies that the board no longer wanted to fund. For new agency requests, agencies that have not previously received funding have not been recommended by staff unless requested by the board or are a newly mandated agency. And some of the reasons for this is that the county provides nearly $3 million, which represents roughly 3.2 cents of the real estate tax rate, to support outside agencies already. Budget requests for existing agencies generally increase each year, and funding for existing agencies is rarely eliminated or reduced. We have some recommendations for what we would like to do in 23. We would like to take a look at the impact of reducing funding if the county is paying more than its fair share. So we would evaluate that and then bring a recommendation to the board on that. New agencies that are inquiring about funding will continue to be provided with request forms and instructions. New agencies serving multiple NRV jurisdictions would be invited to present at the joint budget review meeting. And then we as a staff would evaluate the new request and then provide recommendations to the board on what we think should be funded based on their requests and how it aligns with the other new River Valley jurisdictions. And that's all I have on that presentation, so I'd be glad to answer any questions you have.
All right, I guess we'll just go around and ask, start off with Supervisor King.
I just got one question. I brought this up before during our meetings. Some of these agencies that we've been funding, we got 33 of them, non-mandated agents. Some of them are doing practically the same thing. I was wondering if the board could get a list of all these agencies, the 33 that's non-mandated, to give us an idea so we can look at them. Maybe we can combine some of the funding to do a better job.
We certainly could give you a list.
I mean, when we're handing out taxpayers' money, we need to get the best we can get for the money. Thank you.
All right. Supervisor DeMotts.
Okay, this is going to sound kind of disorganized, my approach to this. So you're just gonna have to kind of keep up, I guess. First, thank you very much for doing this. I did want a better, more detailed overview, and this did provide it. On slide number 2, and I won't hop around, we'll go in order. So slide number 2 on the bottom corner. So I think that's slide number 3 in our packet. Sorry, I was counting the first slide.
3?
I want slide number 2.
2?
Go
Okay.
back. Go back. Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry. Go forward. See, I told you. I warned you before we even started. This is more of a question of a semantics, but I'd like to just clarify that we are not funding 46 outside agencies. We're providing funding to 46 outside agencies.
That's correct.
Because it kind of sounds like if it says we fund 46 outside agencies, it sounds like we've created these agencies.
No, we provide a portion of their funding. That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And then on number 3, for real this time, number 3. So let me just make sure that I'm doing this correctly. The 13 mandated agencies, the funding amount that we give them is a required amount. We don't have a choice. We have to give it to them.
That's correct.
Okay. So we're really talking about 33 agencies that we have some sort of ability to control what we're doing.
That's correct.
So that's 40.3% of the total amount, and I did the math, I'm pretty sure I'm right. It's 40.3% of the total amount of the outside agency funding is going to 33 agencies.
That sounds about right. Yes.
Okay.
Looks right.
Sorry. On the next slide, let's skip that one. Let's go to slide number 5. You did say that you've heard that the agencies really appreciate that. That is anecdotally what I get all the time from people that talk about the joint meeting. Who's at that meeting? What localities are represented there?
Giles County, Floyd County, Montgomery County, Pulaski County,
City of
City of Radford.
Towns?
Towns are not included.
Is there a reason that they're not participating in that?
I don't have a reason. It was set up the way that it was in the past, and we've just kind of continued it.
I
Okay.
think the reason is because the amount of funding they provide is so small compared to the rest of the jurisdictions that we do not invite them. In the very beginning, when we started this, I think we did invite them, and there wasn't a lot of participation, and gradually it's just dropped off.
Okay. That makes sense as an answer. I wonder if it would give us as an organization, not that I think this is something you guys could try to do or should do. If they don't want to participate, then they don't have to be there. But it would give us some light on how agencies, and I'm thinking specifically about Onward NRV from the discussions that we had last year, it would give us a little bit more information about how these agencies are also getting funded from the localities. Because if they're approaching us, chances are they're probably also approaching Blacksburg and Christiansburg.
We do know what funding they're getting from the towns. The towns just don't take part in this.
Oh, okay,
When
great.
I was going to say, when the agencies submit the information for the joint budget review process, they're required to outline all the funding they receive, which does show if they receive any funding from the towns. But as Angie mentioned, in my experience here, most of the time it's the 4 counties and the city. There's very few that receive funding from towns as well.
I think it's an awesome approach. I don't think it's something that we should consider abandoning. I think it's awesome that we do it that way. So when I asked about how explaining this process, it wasn't to totally dismantle the process, because I really like how we do it. On slide number 7, the third bullet, or the second bullet of the second point, budget requests for existing agencies generally increase annually. So the requests increase annually. Do we fund does our funding also increase annually?
It sort of depends. In other words, like I said earlier, we try to provide parity. So if somebody requests additional money and we're not paying our fair share, then we will then calculate what our fair share should be. And if the request, we would either give that amount or whatever they've requested as part of the funding request. If we were paying more than our fair share and they asked for more money, then no, we wouldn't include an increase for it.
Okay.
And that's another benefit of having the group together, because then the localities discuss that at the end of the meeting and at the lunch break about the justification for the request and whether or not each jurisdiction plans to recommend that funding to their board, so we can kind of stay on track with what everybody else is doing at the same time.
I appreciate that. And then final question. And this kind of falls in line with what Todd was, or Supervisor King, I apologize, was asking you about. So we have 33 non-mandated agencies, so there's no, we're not required to fund them at a certain amount. It's very discretionary. Would we be able to see a list of the 33?
Yes.
And in addition to that, and I ask this because I'm thinking of agencies that I've been a part of in the past that were volunteer run or had volunteer boards, and so there's maybe part-time staff, or there's just not a lot of paid leadership, and maybe they're requesting funding, but they don't know to let their elected officials know. Is there any way to also let us know who the new requests are coming from?
The new request?
The new request.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I think that could be interesting, just from if we know who we're funding, maybe we don't need to fund all of those, I'm not sure. But then if we also could know who's asking, it would give us, I think, a better picture of what we could do moving forward. Is that a lot? Is that a huge?
No, that's no
Not at
problem at all. We can do
Okay.
that.
And that's all. Thank you so much for
Yep.
both presentations tonight. They were awesome.
Okay, Supervisor Bone?
I'd also like a list of the 13 mandated. And again, I just want to confirm, we fund what is requested or what is required, not a penny more kind of thing.
There are times that we might fund a little more than than we're required to fund. An example I can think of is some of the agencies that we fund do not finalize their budgets at the time that we submit to you. And so there have been occasions when there's been a small amount of difference and we've funded a slightly higher amount. But generally, even though it's included in the budget at that amount, the agency only bills us for the amount that the contractual agreement is for. So
That's great.
they don't always match exactly to the budgeted amounts, but we do check to make sure that we're paying them the correct amount.
Similar to Supervisor DeMott's, now that I'm on the NRVCS board, I look at the different rates that the different counties in Radford are paying, and they're all over the board. Unlike, Onward NRV, where we were the ones who were really underfunding versus everybody else was funding at a higher rate kind of thing. How do you figure out where to be?
Population.
Because we're not the same as anybody else. We're not more, we're about average,
Are you asking about mandated or non-mandated now, or both?
It must be non-mandated because all the jurisdictions pay at a different rate.
No, that's mandated.
If they're non-mandated, we ask them to provide us with how many clients they serve in each jurisdiction, and then we prorate the amount that we provide to them based on that. As Mark said, in the past, we have not decreased funding to the agencies if the percentage that we needed to pay went down. We would not add to them, but we would pay more. We would not add to them, but we would stay the same. But that is definitely something that we're going to look at this year. It's not a lot of money to the county, the amount that we overfund, but it could be a significant amount to the agency that we're funding. So one approach that we discussed that we might look at is looking at not changing that this year, but letting the agencies know that we're going to evaluate that next year so they have time to plan ahead. Because if we say, oh, well, we're cutting our funding in half and they're a small organization, that could cripple them, and that we don't feel like that's fair. We're going to provide you with that information, though, and we're certainly not going to make, it's your decision, not ours, but we will provide that for you.
So I'm assuming it's non-mandated because the pro rate, or I'm not sure how you say it, per case or what have you, it doesn't come out the same.
And
So-
it could be for community services that it depends on what services are provided for the number of clients served per jurisdiction, because of course they have different rates based on the services they provide. So that could be the case. I'm not sure
That is
about
one-
them specifically.
As we review the agencies in that process, one of the things we always look at are serviceable units, whether it's population or whether it's client served. So there's a couple of ways, and I think in a couple of agencies, some clients have multiple services. so
Right,
that-
I think it's worth me understanding from the NRVCS side, oh, Montgomery County uses more of these services than Giles County, per capita, or whatever, however you want to say it. So I get it. I think that's important to understand for sure. And then, on page 6, on the first main bullet, third bullet in, second bullet of that, it says if the county did cut agency funding, the amount is generally very minimal. About how much is minimal?
It depends on the agency. I mean, there have been agencies in which, we're talking about $1,000. I do the analysis on the agencies every year. So, I mean, I can tell you right now, if you told me the agency, I could tell you exactly what parity would look like and what we would have to reduce in order to get you there. So that analysis is done every year. But I can tell you, just having done it for so many years, that there's not a whole lot of money out there to be had. In other words, there are a few agencies that, if we wanted to draw that hard line, it could potentially cripple them. But they're few and far between. As far as, you might have an agency here or there where you could say 15 grand, but generally speaking, you're talking a couple $100 on an agency based on the number of clients that are served.
So we're talking about $1.1 million, really. And is it less than $50,000? Is that
Oh,
minimal
yeah,
to you?
on a normal year, yes, absolutely.
Is it less than $10,000?
No, I wouldn't say less than 10, but I would say that it would probably be less than 50 for sure.
Less than 20?
I don't have the number right now, but yeah, I mean, I just know that it's.
Sometimes you know the numbers.
Yeah,
and
yeah, it's
sometimes
not a
you
lot of money.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, when you're looking at the request, this year we had $500,000 in requests. I certainly don't have that kind of savings so that you could, shift it around to make that happen.
So part of the 50,000 is almost a teacher's salary and compensation, beginning teacher's salary compensation. So that is a big deal when we want to, have more teachers. But then, if it's remarkably less than 50,000, is this a good use of your time? I don't understand. I don't know. So, but thank you. Excellent presentation.
Okay. Supervisor Shepherd.
I like Supervisor King's idea about looking at the non-mandated and see if there's any crossover and where we're funding multiple agencies to do basically the same thing or part of the same thing. My question is the board or the group that gets together that meets for each county, would that not become apparently clear to them during that process?
Well, I mean, I think what happens is, when we were talking earlier about, how the group gets together, we try and do parity, but a lot of times some of the smaller jurisdictions don't have the ability to fund. They don't have the revenue streams. They don't have the growth that Montgomery County has. And so some of that disparity that you talk about is because we have more ability to fund. And so, we try and keep it in line. And sometimes other jurisdictions don't have that ability to keep things in line, just because they just don't have the funding sources to make it happen on their end. So that creates a little bit of a gap. But, my goal in trying to evaluate the agencies is to put our best foot forward and try and at least match off as best that we can with the resources that we have. If that makes sense.
I guess. It sounded to me like we were talking about two different things, but that's probably just me. It's my understanding what Supervisor King said is, like, if we're paying one agency, I don't know, I can't come up with that stuff off the top of my head, but for childcare, let's say, which I know we don't, and then on the other hand, we're paying another agency dollars for the same service.
Yes, I think a lot of the
Thinking that's
agencies,
what he was
it's not
talking about.
exactly a perfect match for match service. In other words, a lot of those agencies wouldn't exist because it would be duplication of services. So a lot of the agencies that you see when you start looking into them, they provide, like, especially in the human services field, you'll see that they're providing some segment of a specific population that some other agency doesn't fund. Otherwise, if they had an agency that was duplicating services, they wouldn't receive funding for that because there'd be some other source that was funding it. In other words, the money, most of the money that they receive doesn't really come from the county. It comes from federal grants and other sources. So the federal government and these other places wouldn't be funding, they would fund one centralized agency to do these things.
Right.
So a lot of times, I think when you start looking at them, you're not going to necessarily be able to see that they're doing the exact same things, because 9 times out of 10, it's not the exact same things, it's similar things.
Right.
But when you're looking at those jurisdictions, most of the time, you're going to find that one central agency is providing this particular service, and then there's another branch that does something similar, but over here off to the side.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay. Supervisor Fidzikowski.
I understand you explained the outside agency's budget process very well, but it was something that Supervisor DeMott said that made me think maybe I need some clarification. You brought up Onward and you brought in the towns, but it was my understanding about a year ago we raised not just Onward but also 2 others, and it was my understanding that Onward doesn't ask the towns for anything, only counties. Is that still true?
Onward historically has always asked the county a per capita, so right now they're asking for $1 per citizen
Population.
investment in their agency, and they have always asked the 2 towns, I think, for a $5,000 contribution per town. I think it's 5,000.
Right.
So they've always done that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. I thought they weren't part of their process on the population.
They're members at a different level than we are members. We are kind of in the hierarchy of membership. We're at the top, and they're at the bottom. And so they're not on the executive board. They're not. They're mainly just seen as a donor.
Yeah, I understand that. Okay. I didn't realize the towns gave anything, but, and I, being on the regional commission board, I really appreciate how they do it, because they do it by population, but they break it down into towns also. But they also provide a service that specifically benefits towns. But I do think Onward may be one of those agencies that Supervisor King was talking about. We have several that do economic development, but I think Mark, you hit on that. There's some nuances that actually make them a little different from each other, and I'm not suggesting that we change that, but I just needed to get that clarified. Thank you both.
Vice Chair Biggs.
as you well know, people have come to individual board members and asked, hey, how do we get funded? You know, and now everyone's aware of the process, you know, hey, you need to, you know, get in there and you need to fill out the paperwork and do all of this. But it would be interesting to see the ones that we have for the new request. If you remember in your budget document, you know, if you go to where it says other outside agencies, and I think a lot of times, you know, when we get that whole big budget document, it's really hard to go through every single page, but you all do a really good job in talking about the request of other agencies and why you either, you know, honored it or you gave them more or less. And I think that, you know, having an understanding, like I think what Supervisor King is asking for is having like maybe a little bit more understanding of what they specifically do. But if you go in your budget document, it's really well done. So thank you for that, and I hope that continues. That's all.
Absolutely.
And Mark, I would just, again, thank you. It's detailed, and as Vice Chair Biggs said, there is a description in the budget of each of those agencies, and either if you gave or not, and the services they provide. But also, it would be interesting to see what the overlap is, like Supervisor King had said, in some of these agencies, if they're providing, or even getting a little bit more detailed. Several questions. When, and I think the structure is great that everybody is on the same page, so all the jurisdictions that are stakeholders know which each one, they're given the same presentation and they kind of already know and the services provided. Is there ever, first of all, are there updates that we're giving? So other than just I guess it's just the yearly, at this yearly joint meeting is the update. Okay, at the update, is there ever, and probably, this has probably not happened, but is there ever a surplus or where the organization had a surplus or some funds that weren't used?
That happens from time to time. In other words, there's some that bill specifically for certain services. I can tell you that, you know, one agency that comes to mind is you guys provide a congregate meal program, and when COVID hit, they weren't able to get out and do that, so there was surplus monies because they couldn't provide the meal. So there are instances where that happens. One of the other board members, I don't remember when we were going around, asked about you know, how we fund, you know, how the funding can be different. An example is each year I do a reconciliation for cooperative extension, and then we match off the salaries that the state provides. So that happens in August. And so if I don't have enough money in the budget, I'll come to you with a supplemental appropriation in order to correct their budget. And then we sign an agreement that we have with them on that. So to answer your question, yes, there are times in which, you know, that they don't use all the money. Cooperative extension is an example. They had a vacancy, and so they don't bill us for that vacancy when they don't have the position filled. So it does happen, but I wouldn't say that there's a lot of excess money left over. I mean, we provide the money to them, and for the most part, they use it.
Okay, very good. And then how often historically does the county add new outside agencies that are not existing? How often have we done that historically?
Generally speaking, staff never adds them. When you guys, as board members, have them come to you and you decide that that's something that you want to fund, and you are able to get a majority of the board to support you on that, then we add those. So last year we added a couple. You know, it's sporadic. A lot of it has to do sometimes with the amount of funding that the county has available and whether or not a board member is passionate enough to push forward to take some of that funding for that. So over the years, there's been, you know, a few, but there's not a tremendous number that have been added since I've been here.
Okay. And it would be good to have the list, at least we would know who's asking, so we would know as a board as well. And then are there any incidents where one of the stakeholders or other counties do not pay their portion and that the other members have to step up?
Yes, that happens, you know, from time to time. I mean, that's why in those write-ups that you discuss, we show the actual, the distribution of funding and the percentage of clients served. So you can go in there and actually look and see, okay, you know, we're at least providing 50% of the funding for 50% of the clients, and you can look at the other jurisdictions and see where they are. Again, you know, we try to provide our fair share, but we also recognize that sometimes some of those agencies or localities don't have the same funding streams that we do, so they're not able to provide at the same level.
And when these groups meet at this joint meeting and they're asking for their requests, do they also share how their own agencies fundraise, or you have an idea of what they bring on their own and help them with other grants or opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually, they have to fill out a complete financial package that tells us all the information, all their revenue sources. And they also have to submit a financial statement.
Very good. And are there any of these outside agencies that we fund, do we offer any other benefits for them, like sites, locations, properties, or anything of that nature?
Yes, there are a few in which there are things besides the actual dollar amount that is provided, such as building space.
And that would be disclosed to us, and we know, I know sometimes, I do believe that's in the description.
Yes.
And do we count that? How do we count that?
We don't put a monetary value
Yeah,
on
we don't
that.
put a monetary value on it. Well, actually, we do. We in the budget document, you know, for the one that I'm thinking of, I think I have $8 a square foot based on their square footage to kind of give you a value for that. That $8 figure may be low, to be honest with you, but that number is not factored into the funding formula for a client served.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you again. Thank you so much for your work on this. Supervisor Bone?
In the book, the big fat budget book, for the mandated agencies, is there a little footnote saying, could you do that? That would be great.
We can do that. It's organized by the category that Mark listed on the first slide. But we can definitely put an asterisk or something to say. And generally, in the write-up, it says if it is required. I looked up community services while we were talking, and the state code sets that amount. So that's how.
Do you reference the state code also?
Yes.
That's awesome. But instead of, just having an asterisk or something like that, or
We
I don't
could
know
just
how you
put
would do it.
mandated
Yeah.
or non-mandated.
Yeah.
That we can
That
do
would be
that.
great. Thank you. That's it.
Any additional follow-up questions?
But I just got one. Now it was brought up. If we're in with other jurisdictions and we're supplying the office space or whatever, we're paying for lights and air and heat and all this, why would that not be deducted for what we pay?
It just traditionally we haven't put a dollar value associated with that, and some of it we don't necessarily provide heating sources in the funding request. We do provide a building for
One agency.
one agency.
That's what I was trying to think. I don't think, I'd have to look because I can't remember off the top of my head either. I don't think there's any of these agencies that we provide, as I would call it, a full ride, building utilities, all of that. But when we give you this complete list, we'll make sure we note what facilities we may be providing also.
All right, thank you.
Can I make one comment? There's also, and without further information, I'm thinking specifically about the cooperative extension that's here in our building. I think there's actually a value to us, to our citizens, to have that located here that you can't really attach a dollar amount to. So I think that there might be some cases where it benefits,
Intangible benefits.
yes, the citizens of Montgomery County to have the office for that agency located in Montgomery County for convenience or access or services or something like that. Does that make sense? I don't know if that would be true in all cases, but I know in that one it definitely is.
Okay, anything else? Mark, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the discussion on that item, because I know that's been a topic that several of you have mentioned to me for a while, that you really wanted us to spend some time sharing. The last thing we have under work session this evening is the proposed budget calendar for the fiscal year 23 budget. We have been talking about this, but I don't know that we've shared it with the board or made sure that you're aware of it. So I believe Jennifer is bringing up a flash drive that's going to put it right on the screen.
Previously, we brought this to you and had you approve it formally, which created problems later because it is a planning tool and sometimes the calendar doesn't work out like we think it will. And so if we had you approve the budget calendar and then a change needed to be made, you would have to act on that. So instead of doing that, we have the proposed calendar here. Some of you may know that the school board presented their budget to the administration submitted their budget to their board and had some work session days that didn't exactly line up with what we had planned. And I spoke with Mr. Krantz about that, and we worked through those differences. So this does reflect what the school board approved on Thursday night as well.
And really, I know Jen's trying to get it all on one screen, but really if you just scroll down, Jen, to March and April, that's where, that too. January and February are just the standard board meeting dates, the second and fourth Monday nights. Where the additional meetings come into play are in March and in April. In March, on March the 7th, the first Monday night at 6 p.m. Is when I'll be making the presentation of the proposed budget to the board. We usually do that prior to the PSA meeting on that first Monday. Then there will be a special meeting. Jen, I hate to ask you to do that. Can you step back up there and just scroll back down to the calendar so we can see the blocks a little better too? Just for March and April.
Might be able to zoom out a little bit.
There you go. That's good. That's good. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. As I mentioned, March 7th will be the budget presentation to the board. March 14th is a regular board meeting. March 15th, that Tuesday night, will be a joint meeting with the Board of Supervisors and the school board. That's when the superintendent will present his proposed fiscal year 2023 budget for the schools, so that you can be aware of what specifically the school will be looking for in their request. Monday, March 21st is a special meeting. No, I'm sorry, that's the, that says 7:15 for budget work session on the calendar, but we usually do those at 6. That was what was throwing me. Usually when we have a called meeting, we try to do them at 6 o'clock. So that meeting on the 21st of March, I think we'll probably do it 6. It's a special meeting. It won't be a regular board meeting.
On the 21st?
21st of March, yes, ma'am.
It says it's regular.
Nope.
Regular board meeting.
Nope, not the 21st.
The regular ones have green
Green around
squares
them.
Oh, it
Yeah.
doesn't say. I was looking at the different. Okay.
No worries. The 21st will be a budget work session that evening to give the board an opportunity to discuss any questions you have on the budget. Then March 28th is a regular board meeting night. And as we have done in years past, we will have a work session scheduled in that regular board meeting for budget discussion, should you want to have that. Then moving to April, a special meeting on Thursday night, April 7th at 6 o'clock. That is the public hearing that we're required to have on the proposed budget and the advertised tax rate. April 11th is a regular board meeting. We'll have a work session on the agenda for that evening for budget work session discussion if needed. Monday, April 18th is a called special meeting at 6 o'clock. That is for the board to consider adoption of the budget and establish the tax rate for fiscal year 2023. We always have a called meeting to consider adoption of the budget and establishment of the tax rate, simply to allow for as much time as possible for the Commissioner of Revenue and Treasurer to get the tax tickets out, since we do twice a year billing. And then April 25th is a regular board meeting that if, hopefully everything will go well on the 18th. If for some reason it doesn't, we do have April 25th that we could take an action as well. But so you can see that March and April are the times where we have extra meetings. We will email this calendar out to the board members as well, so you'll have that. I know several of you are trying to make sure you've got them in your calendars. We'll make sure that that gets out so that you have it.
We wanted to make sure you didn't have any changes that you wanted to propose before we sent that to you.
Should, because it's, yeah, we'll fix that. Thank you. That would be 6 o'clock. Yes, ma'am. Yes, but the correction that we need to make in the verbiage down below is on the March 21st meeting. It'll start at 6 o'clock. It does say budget work session, but that is a special meeting that night. It's not part of a regular meeting night, so we'll get that cleared up.
Just so I don't show up at 7:15 wondering where everybody went.
Right.
So as is typical this time of year, we'll just see you every Monday night in March and April.
Right. Very good. All right. Do I have a motion to come out of work session?
Motion.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion? Madam Clerk, if you'll call the roll.
Aye.
Aye.
Mr. Fidzikowski?
Aye.
Mr. King?
Aye.
Ms. Biggs?
Aye.
Mr. Motts?
Aye.
Chair Blevins?
Aye.
7 ayes.
Okay, next is items of consent. Do I have a motion?
Motion.
Second.
A motion and a second. Any discussion? Madam Clerk, if you'll call the roll.
Mr. Shepherd?
Aye.
Mr. Fidzikowski?
Aye.
Mr. King?
Aye.
Ms. Biggs?
Aye.
Mr. Motts?
Aye.
Ms. Bone?
Aye.
Chair Blevins?
Aye.
7 ayes.
And now on to reports. County Attorney.
No report tonight, Madam Chair.
No report. Mr. Meadows, County Administrator.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple of items this evening. I certainly, again, appreciate all of Mark's work. We've been spending quite a bit of time behind the scenes working diligently on the budget for fiscal year 2023. That will start coming together over the next couple of weeks, and as we just mentioned with the budget timetable, I'll be presenting the proposed budget to you on Monday night, March 7th. Several of us will be traveling to Richmond next week for VACO Legislative Day on Thursday, February 3rd. Look forward to having an opportunity to meet with our legislative delegation and share our thanks for things that they're moving forward on our behalf, and also remind them of some of the concerns we have with some of the other legislation that may be out there that affect localities. We certainly appreciate all the hard work that they do, but we also want to remind them of, as I always say, do no harm to the localities while you're in Richmond. And Madam Chair, that's all I have this evening. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Now reports from the supervisors. We'll start off with Supervisor DeMott.
Oh, I don't have a report tonight.
Okay, thank you. Supervisor Bone.
I'd like to tell everybody that you can attend the Dialogue on Race this Saturday, January 29th at Christiansburg Middle School at 10 a.m. They always do a good job, and it's a very needed program. Thank you. That's it.
Very good. Supervisor Shepherd.
I don't have any report. I'd just like to say I thank Administrator and his staff for the work on the budget.
Thank you, sir.
Supervisor Fidzikowski.
No report.
Supervisor King.
I don't have no report, but I would like the board to think about something. You know, the last governor come out and said he's gonna give teachers raise 10%, but he's looking for the localities to add that 5% so they pay 5%. I don't know what's gonna happen this round, but I'd like for each one of you to consider us sending a letter to the governor, lieutenant governor, and all of our representatives up there to ask them, if you're gonna give them a raise and tell them you're gonna pay them a raise, how about doing it? I don't mind paying our share, but when it comes out that we're gonna do this, oh yeah, but the localities have to do it too. I mean, that's not right. And I wish y'all would just consider that. Maybe at our next meeting, we could bring it up again. And also, I'd like to thank the spouses of our staff. We're getting ready to go into budget sessions, and I apologize for keeping them out late. That's all.
Vice Chair Biggs.
I wanted to compliment our chair, Chair Blevins, for her effort last week to put out the summary of the board meeting. And I gather you're going to do that after each board meeting on Facebook. So that's a good thing for citizens to follow along. And the only other thing, I guess you all are aware that we do have a representative from our county on the parole board now at the state level, and that is our sheriff, Sheriff Barton. That's a pretty important position. So Montgomery County is represented. And that's all.
Very good. Yes, I'd like just to echo congratulations to Sheriff Parton, that he will serve Southwestern Virginia and Virginia very well. Congratulations on the parole board. And just for clarification, so with Supervisor King and I agree, and that may be something that the entire board would be in consensus to do letters, is that if they're going to say 5% raise, that it's understand that they're providing the 5%, and kind of sounds disingenuous when it's 5%, but the county has to pay half of that. So for clarification, but I think that, I don't want to speak for the entire board, but I do believe that we would all be in support of that clarification for that, to do that. I also wanted just to thank all of our first responders with the snowstorm of the 16th and 17th, and all the staff for being able to get back to work and serving our citizens. I understand from our our emergency services answered 80 calls and assisted during that snowstorm, and just appreciate all of their hard work and dedication, because it was really cold and really bad, and we appreciate all their services. And I look forward to, with some of the board members attending VACO this coming up week, and again, meeting with our delegations and what they, thank them and what they can do to move Montgomery forward. And is there anything else?
Yeah, this goes with Supervisor King and what we're talking about. The problem isn't just the salary. The problem is that they only do it for SOQ positions, and every single school division in the state of Virginia has more than SOQ positions. So when you start talking about that, the state still is not doing their part, even if they were to give the full salary, okay? It comes back to us, we have a lot more than the designated SOQ positions. So just remember that if you want to add that in there too.
Well, I have said in several meetings, school system, and I respect them all, but the school system also has bus drivers, custodians. When you look at one group of people, it falls back on everybody else. I mean, the state needs to realize you got more people in the schools besides just teachers.
You got it.
Thank you.
Very good. And if there's nothing else, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
We're gonna have a big list.
And some of them,
Big list.
well, see, and some of them, like